tonight calls for Prince Andrew to give compensation to taxpayers as it emerges he's not paid rent on his Windsor mansion for 2 decades. Robert Jenrick says that Prince Andrew has disgraced the royal family, while the Lib Dem says he has betrayed the values of the British people. Downing Street seem determined not to get involved, but the pressure from inside Parliament is mounting tonight. Also ahead, breaking news: plans for Donald Trump to sit down with Vladimir Putin in Hungary has suddenly been put on hold. We'll ask if the peace talks have suddenly gone sour. Also, the government insists the grooming gang inquiry is not in crisis as a third abuse survivor quits and one of the candidates to run it rules herself out. We'll have the latest. Also tonight, the chief executive of Lloyds Bank exclusively tells us if the government taxes banks like his, householders and businesses will suffer. Plus, the COVID inquiry. Here's Boris Johnson was in a homicidal mood over the chaos around school exams. We'll bring you the key moments from his appearance earlier. And a former president in prison, a shocking theft in Paris, a government in chaos. We'll look at the remarkable series of calamities to befall France. Well, it's chipper, though, on this side of the channel tonight. Gwen Tyler and Andrew Fisher will be with us for the next hour. It's Tuesday. I'm Darren McCaffrey, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. A very good evening and welcome to the programme. We're going to start with that breaking news tonight because over the last few days, Donald Trump had been sounding pretty warm towards the Russian leader Vladimir Putin as he pushes for an end to the war in Ukraine. We had heard reports that Mr. Trump and President Zelensky had a pretty contentious meeting in the White House last Friday. And last week, we've been told, after a phone call between Trump and Putin, that the pair would meet in Budapest in Hungary. Well, the latest tonight is that those plans are very much on hold. Let's go live to Washington now, bring in our US correspondent, David Blevins, who's there for us. And David, this seems to have followed another telephone call yesterday between Lavrov and Rubio that didn't go very well.
That's right. The White House is describing that telephone conversation between Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov as productive, but it didn't produce a date for a sit-down meeting between them, never mind one between the two presidents, and therefore plans for a second Trump-Putin summit in quick succession are firmly on hold. I think we have to assume one of two things: that Donald Trump was overly optimistic after his lengthy telephone conversation with Vladimir Putin last Thursday, when he suggested that they would meet probably within 2 weeks, or that something has happened in the interim to throw a spanner in the works. Well, a couple of things have happened. First of all, we have had that meeting with Zelensky at the White House. Afterwards, Donald Trump said it had been cordial, but there are reports now that it was anything but. That's not surprising, given that the president appeared to have moved from suggesting Ukraine could win back all its land to suggesting that the two sides should just draw a line and call it quits. The other thing of significance, of course, is that Keir Starmer and other European leaders have issued a statement urging Washington to hold firm on its demand that Russia agrees to a ceasefire before there is any negotiation around territory. And diplomats in Europe and here in America are interpreting this postponement as an indication that Russia is not prepared to agree a ceasefire or to concede anything in terms of its demands, and therefore Washington isn't prepared to agree to a summit or to risk a summit that delivers nothing at this point.
OK, David, live for us there in Washington tonight. Thank you very much indeed. Well, let's move on to our main story tonight, and that is, of course, around Prince Andrew and the royal family, because I want to talk to you about the problem of the Prince Andrew, as he's formerly known, because as we've been reminded of in recent days, aside from the seemingly endless lurid allegations, is that we do have a constitutional monarchy, but we don't necessarily have a constitution, or at least one that's properly codified. And so it raises the question about what to do with Andrew's remaining titles, what to do about his grace and favour mansion, whether the king has gone far enough. That's all bled into our politics today, with an increasing number of MPs now demanding more. And ultimately, why not? After all, Westminster Parliament is meant to be ultimately sovereign. But many within government and elsewhere are clearly keen to tread carefully here, suggesting that it really should be the king who should be sovereign when it comes to royal titles. And so with our kind of hodgepodge constitution, we're once again trying to muddle through, because there is no set rule or path to follow, whether it's on Andrew, Baroness Mone, or previous rows over people like Sir Fred Goodwin and Dame Paula Venables. These endless rows don't just cause political consternation, but with the public, I do think they undermine trust and endorsement of the entire system. Maybe, here's a thought, maybe we should actually just come up with a better, a proper system that means that we just don't end up here again. Well, let's get more on today's developments and where we stand tonight with our royal correspondent, Rhiannon Mills.
This is Lord Peter Roslin, one of the most trusted people in the King's household. The Lord Steward who manages the King and Queen's personal affairs and arrangements. But between 2003 and 2014, he was head of the Royalty and Diplomatic Protection Team for the Metropolitan Police. And that covers 2011, when it's claimed Prince Andrew asked one of his police officers to unlawfully dig up dirt about his accuser, Virginia Giuffre. Now, it's really important to stress that we don't know whether or not Peter Loughborough, which is the name that he went by when he worked for the Met Police, whether or not he knew about these requests from Prince Andrew. But when you talk to police sources, they will tell you that the officer involved would have been expected to tell more senior staff about it. We approached Lord Roslin for a comment. He passed us to Buckingham Palace, who said we should approach the Metropolitan Police as it regarded his time in the force. The Met repeated what they said at the weekend, that they are actively looking into the claims made against Prince Andrew. With Virginia Giuffre's book released today, the calls for swifter action have grown louder, partly out of respect for Giuffre and Epstein's other victims.
It should become clear that nobody's above the law. It doesn't matter whether you're a prince or whether you're a duke, whoever you are. You should be held accountable if you've committed crimes. And that's the message that should come out of this loudly and clearly, and not just here in the United Kingdom, but around the world.
But explosive headlines about his home at Royal Lodge on the Windsor estate have caused further embarrassment for the royal family, after it's come out that he's paid peppercorn rent since 2003, so effectively nothing. He did pay £1 million when he took on the house and £7.5 million to refurbish it. But there are now calls for the National Audit Office to look again at his rental arrangements.
He is accused of attempting to corrupt police officers by asking them to help him besmirch the name of Virginia Giuffre.
It is just another example of how the noise simply will not go away around Prince Andrew. Protesters outside the Windsor estate calling for further action against him as he continues to vehemently deny all the allegations. Rhiannon Mills, Sky News.
Well, in a moment, we'll be speaking to our chief political correspondent, John Craig. But first, let's bring in Rhiannon Mills, who, as you can see, joined us from the newsroom. And as you pointed out there, this does just rumble on day after day. New suggestions, new allegations, yet more controversy.
Well, yeah, so Friday night was incredibly dramatic when we had that statement directly from Prince Andrew, and it was put to me yesterday that for the palace that was the swiftest way to do things to bring about a necessary outcome. But it seems that it really has not been enough. We are now on to, third or fourth day of headlines about Prince Andrew. And I think, especially this morning, it would have been very difficult reading for those within the palace. When you look at the fact that we're facing a cost of living crisis, and then there's all those headlines saying that Prince Andrew has not paid any rent for over 20 years. That is hugely embarrassing. And I think, of course, Royal Lodge continues to be one of the problems hanging over the royal family. There is this lease with the Crown Estate, so some would say that actually the King can't really do much about it. His hands are tied. What he can potentially do, though, is take away a couple of Prince Andrew's honours. He could do that without any acts of Parliament. Of course, his peerages are a slightly more complex and difficult matter. Also, of course, there is that issue of the potential police investigation escalation that we could see when we had those allegations coming over the weekend that Prince Andrew has asked a police officer to try and dig up dirt about Virginia Giuffre, and the fact that we now know that Lord Roslin, who is one of the King's most trusted aides, he's the Lord Steward, he basically organises all of the King and Queen's private arrangements. He is so senior within the royal household, and yet he was head of royal protection during that time, during 2011, when those allegations are made against Prince Andrew. Now, no suggestion that he has done anything wrong, but I think it is interesting, again, who knew what within the palace, and are we going to find out any more? I think there is that kind of gathering attention now around it, but yeah, we wait to see what more may come over the coming days.
OK, Rhiannon, live for us there in the newsroom. Thank you very much indeed. Well, in the studio with me is John Craig, our chief political correspondent. John, and what's also been interesting today is the voices inside Parliament have got slightly louder, most notably, of course, Robert Jenrick.
Robert Jenrick, yes. Let's not forget he's a Privy Councillor from his time as a Tory Cabinet Minister. He said today, he says that Andrew has disgraced both the royal family and the nation. The Prince must no longer be allowed to live in Royal Lodge. It's about time Prince Andrew took himself off to live in private and make his own way in life. He's disgraced himself. He's embarrassed the royal family time and again. I don't see why the taxpayer, frankly, should continue to foot the bill at all. Now, the Liberal Democrats, one of their rising stars, Lisa Smart, who is
on this programme in a couple of minutes, by the way.
Who is a spokesperson for the Cabinet Office, says Andrew has failed our king and royal family and betrayed the values of the British people. The longer this whole saga goes on, more his presence in public life is an insult, increasingly an embarrassment. And she says he should return every penny of rent he's not paid while disgracing his office. Meanwhile, the minor parties, led by Stephen Flynn, who is the Westminster leader of the SNP, well, there are 19 MPs who have tabled a early day motion. Now, I'm not a great fan of early day motions. They are Parliament's graffiti wall, quite frankly. But the SNP, backed by some Plaid MPs and some Greens, have called on the government to take legislative steps to remove the dukedom granted to Prince
But there is
Andrew.
no sense, John, tonight that the government's going to take this into their own hands. At the moment, the official line seems to be it's up to the palace.
Every minister over the last, 48 hours, from Ed Miliband on Sky News on Sunday morning, Bridget Phillips and Peter Kyle, that's what they're saying. But contrast that. I mean, I remember the year of the Annus Horribilis, when everything went wrong for the royal family, the fire at Windsor, the divorce of Charles and Diana. I remember John Major taking a lead at the time, making statements in Parliament, helping William and Harry, who were very young at the time. Compare that with an almost deafening silence from Sir Keir Starmer, who, as you say, just seems to say, oh, staying out of that one, it's a bit controversial, whereas John Major showed a lead back all those years ago. OK, well, this is a story that's not going to go away, and he may well forced into that position. John, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. John Craig there. Let's go now to the royal historian, Kate Williams, who joined us. Kate, and we're going to come on to a little bit of the history in a second, but can I just put to you that there was clearly an attempt, a hope, I would say, by Buckingham Palace to maybe dampen down this story, maybe put a lid on it last Friday, and it's done anything but that.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. This was damage limitation that we saw on Friday evening, really at the last minute, considering that Mrs. Giuffre's memoir was coming out today. It was damage limitation in which the Duke said he was stepping back from his title, the Duke of York, and no longer being a member of the Order of the Garter. And really, instead, I think, of dampening down the story, as you say, it's actually intensified it, with people saying, but why didn't he step back from this before? In 2019, he was no longer a working royal. In 2022, he gave up his military titles, and that was really due to a petition from members of the armed forces saying we don't want Andrew to represent us anymore, considering what has gone on. And now he stepped back from the Duke of York title. People are still saying, well, didn't he step back from it? He could still use it if he wants. And I think lots of people think maybe he's using it in private. Really, what people are now thinking about are these two main areas. Should he be stripped of it in Parliament? Because the King can't take Duke of York off Andrew. It has to be taken through an Act of Parliament. And as John was saying there, Parliament is saying we don't want to get involved. But should the Parliament actually formally strip him of his Duke of York title? And should he move out of Royal Lodge? You showed some footage there of Royal Lodge during Rhiannon's very interesting report, and that really showed how gigantic Royal Lodge here is. It's a huge property, 30 rooms, doesn't even describe how large it is. It dates back to the 17th century. It's worth an absolute fortune. I mean, worth tens of millions of pounds, and he's living in it for peppercorn rent. And I think people's focus is increasingly going to be on that. They're going to be saying, but the Crown Estate pays for this, and we essentially are funding the Crown. It's the Crown Estate, we're paying for it, and why does Andrew still get to live there? So the story is not dampened. It's literally gone up in greater flames.
Is there a sense, and it's been suggested by others as well, that actually what they're trying to do is kind of keep Andrew slightly inside the tents, as in there might be a fear in Buckingham Palace if they completely expel him effectively from the royal family, that he might go off and do things that could do even more damage, write books, sit down on television interviews, spill all the beans?
Well, we might consider that when Andrew gave that interview, which really started everything in 2019 to Emily Maitlis on the BBC Newsnight programme, that we remember that after that, in which he said all these, expressed no sympathy for the victims, and said he had stopped seeing Epstein after 2010, and said all that, those ridiculous alibis about Pizza Express and all the rest of it. He thought he'd acquitted himself marvellously. Andrew was very pleased with how it went. And one might say, well, if that's what Andrew feels has gone well in terms of a television interview, what would he say when he's actually trying to say something that does damage the royal family, because he thought he'd rescued everyone's reputations then. So certainly Andrew could say these matters, but there is a difference between putting Andrew totally out of the royal family and also saying to him, you can move into another property in Windsor. There are many, many properties on the Windsor estate, many much smaller properties. And we know that Charles has tried to encourage Andrew to move to Frogmore Cottage.
And he's just not moving. And Kate, just very finally on all of this, is this in part what I seem to be suggesting earlier, that this is kind of the quagmire of our constitution, is that it's such a hodgepodge, there's no kind of set rules, and we go through this endless process all the time because effectively there's no process, I suppose, in place?
Yes, you're absolutely right. There's no process. It's all a hodgepodge. There's no real constitution. We have a vision of a constitutional monarch, but we don't really have any rules or even a contract that they sign. And we have a situation in which the royal family is both a business and has a constitutional role, but also they're a family. So you can't fire someone in the same way that we would if we were an employee being touched by allegations like this. So this is this sort of quagmire. And I think the consequence of this is also there's a lot of, when it comes to the royal family, it is about message and it is about perception. And this is really about what the royal family represent. And clearly, there are a lot of people who feel it's very damaging. And I think the voices increasingly to strip the Duke of York of his title through Parliament are going to increase. And that could be very damaging to the royal family, because during the debate, MPs could say, well, all kinds of things. And these matters are going to be extremely damaging to the royal family. So certainly, Mrs. Giuffre is sadly no longer with us. We have to remember the suffering of the victims under Epstein. She's no longer with us, but certainly her book is having a huge amount of effect and a huge amount of power.
Yeah, a massive effect, Kate. And as you say, if it comes down to messaging or perception, frankly, at the moment, the royal family are not doing well on both. We really appreciate your time and your insight this evening, Kate Williams there. Well, speaking about what may well happen in Parliament, we have got that MP Lisa Smart with us from the Liberal Democrats, a rising star, I think John Craig described you as. But Lisa, let's talk about this. What do you want to see happen here?
So I think the public have a right to expect a level of transparency they don't feel they've got so far. We've had the lease emerge this afternoon of Prince Andrew's stay at Royal Lodge, and Kate was talking about some of the details of the scale of this property. Looking at the details of the lease, I think people are right to want to look into that a little bit more. Where did the money come from to begin with to fund these fairly lavish refurbishments? And how is it that he's been able to live the life of a prince on a peppercorn rent, but at the cost to the taxpayer?
Well, there's lots of suggestions that money may have come from the late Queen.
And I think people are right to have questions about that. I think the public need to have a sense of trust in our institutions. And we talk in Parliament a lot about how that trust is crumbling in lots of different ways. And I'd include the royal family in that. I think it's the right thing to expect a level of transparency around these financial arrangements, around the Crown estate, because it is at the taxpayer's expense, and people have got a right to expect that.
Yeah, but the thing is, and this is why it's so complicated, isn't it, in part, because the royal family are a public institution that we do fund, but they're also a private family who also have their own ways of generating income. And isn't this the problem? Parliament has got a very kind of unique, let's call it, I was going to call it an odd, but let's call it a unique relationship with the royal family.
Yeah, I think both of those things.
Do you think Parliament needs to assert its sovereignty here, essentially?
So
Do you think, essentially, if the King is not willing to get rid of Prince Andrew's title, Parliament should step in?
I think when it comes to finances and when we're coming to the Crown estate and when we're coming to taxpayers' expenses, taxpayers' money, I think Parliament has a really important role to play there. And you'll have heard from some parliamentary colleagues talking about scrutiny, talking about transparency. I think that's absolutely right. I think, Kate, and you were talking about our lack of constitutional clarity, perhaps, let's say. And titles are a matter for the King. I'm not sensing a clamour from very many colleagues from some of the larger parties to spend that precious legislative time in Parliament talking about Prince Andrew's titles or not. We're absolutely right to think about the victims.
I think given the fact that most MPs would probably vote for it, I'm not entirely sure it would eat up much legislative time. But the point here is, if you leave it into the hands of the monarch and the monarch's not willing to act, even if public opinion wants things to change, then surely Parliament then has a right to assert.
I think there are many things in this country the public want to change. My inbox is full of people complaining about things they want to be different. I don't think, personally, that there is enough of a clamour in Parliament to spend that precious legislative time focusing on this. I'm not getting a sense from the public that it's their priority that we think about the titles of one individual or not. I do think that a level of transparency and a level of scrutiny should be something the public expect. Prince Andrew has embarrassed the King. He has gone completely contrary to the values that we as Britain hold dear. And I think the public are right to expect that transparency so that they can make their minds up whether it's on or not.
OK, Lisa, we appreciate your time this evening. Thank you very much indeed. And, of course, this story is going to feature almost certainly again quite heavily in tomorrow's papers, and we'll have an extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the Deputy Editor of the Conservative Home, Henry Hill, and the journalist and broadcast, Jenny Kleeman. That's from 10:30 tonight here on Sky News. Well, let's bring in our duo for this evening, former Director of Communications for Reform UK, Gwaine Tyler, and the former Labour Party Director of Policy, Andrew Fisher. Good evening, gentlemen. Andrew, let's start with you. What do you think should happen here?
I'm less bothered about his house and his titles. I want an inquiry that helps get to the bottom of the Jeffrey Epstein paedophile ring, frankly, and I think we ought to remember the victims in this. I think arguing over how much rent he pays or doesn't pay is beside the point. The scandal of this, look, I'm a Republican, I'd like to see all the royal family pay rent to us, and not the other way around, where we pay them. But that's separate. That's a separate issue. And in this setting, it's completely trivial. Prince Andrew is alleged to have been involved in, raping women who have been trafficked. That's the allegation, which he vehemently denies. I'll say it before you do.
But also, there's not been proven in court or any sense.
But, you don't tend to pay people £12 million on the basis that they've said something you disagree with. The fact of the matter is there hasn't been a public inquiry into the Epstein scandal. There's a push for it in the US. There should be a push for it here. There are many UK figures who were involved with Jeffrey Epstein as well. And I think
the police have previously looked at this and said that they don't think there's enough evidence.
Well, I think interviewing people who knew him well, whether that's Prince Andrew, whether that's Peter Mandelson, whether that's other people who knew him as well, absolutely, let's try and get to the bottom of this, because clearly people did know what was going on, and, it was covered up for years. It's one of the most, probably the most notorious paedophile ring on earth, involving some of the most powerful people, former presidents, current president, potentially. It is a huge scandal.
Yeah, in saying that, let's be clear. As unsavoury as it is, being a friend with a paedophile, even a convicted paedophile, is not a criminal offence. And thus far, that's the only thing that, essentially, we do know for definite about Prince Andrew.
Well, we know for definite, but there are very serious allegations. There's more in Virginia Giuffre's book about the number of times she slept with Prince Andrew, details of it that are regarded by a lot of people as quite credible. and surely warrant investigation. And the fact he hasn't had his collar felt, I think, is the biggest scandal here, not whether he's called Duke or whatever, because the British public have already got several names for Prince Andrew, which I won't repeat on air.
There's certainly a sense that, I mean, even amongst government ministers who are threading quite carefully on this, that he should volunteer himself up to the police just to have a conversation at the very, very least.
I would certainly think that probably inviting the American police over here, I don't trust the American justice system at all, so I'd have the American police come over here and interview him under caution, yes. But I do feel that in some ways, though it's a little bit dicey for the government what's going on, I think the government are delighted that this is covering the headlines and the front pages and all the rest of it. This is just taking serious stuff off the news. It is creating a huge amount of space. The constitutional arguments you're talking about, they're massive and complex and all the rest of it, and we're not going to change them. I agree just now that wasting parliamentary time would be a waste of time. I agree with you. There are important things, but look, the agreement was made with the Crown Estates under the Queen. He was her favourite son. She forgave him everything, always. And that deal was done at that point. I suspect it's a contract. Are you going to break the contract? How are you going to do that? What's the legality there? Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff that's going to be...
We're not going to get into this. I think the reason this matters as a story beyond kind of, you know, there are a lot of important stuff happening in the world today, there's no doubt, but this is a sense that potentially, and this, as you've rightly pointed out, is a wider group of people who may well, through privilege, have got away with something quite horrendous. Now, we don't know that for definite, and there's lots of difficulties about investigating it, but I think that gets to the heart of why it is an important...
I think a proper police investigation, yes.
But we do know lots of privileged people, whether that includes Prince Andrew or not, but we do know lots of privileged people in Jeffrey Epstein's circle have got away with this, because he is the only person, and along with Ghislaine Maxwell, who have seen anything like the inside of a jail cell from that paedophile ring, which is effectively what it was.
True that. OK, gentlemen, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. OK, you're watching The Politics Hub here on Sky News. A lot going on tonight. A third survivor has quit the national inquiry into grooming gangs, as the Conservatives are calling it this evening, a process that is descending into chaos. We'll be talking about that after the break. Stay tuned.
I witnessed the complete destruction of a place linked to my childhood memories.
This is insane.
I'm Yusra Al-Bagher, Sky's Africa correspondent based in Johannesburg, South Africa. I felt awe when we saw the mountain gorillas in Rwanda.
We call him the king of the jungle. This is the alpha silverback.
Sky News, get the full story first.
Welcome back to Sky News and the Politics Hub. Now, a third survivor has resigned from their role in the national inquiry into grooming gangs. The person hasn't yet been named, but they do follow Fiona Goddard and Ellie Reynolds, two prominent survivors who've quit the panel over the last 48 hours, expressing concern about how the process has been handled. And indeed, actually, in the last couple of minutes, we believe that Fiona Goddard has actually called on the Safeguarding Minister, Jess Phillips, to either stand down or be removed. And it all comes as it's yet again this issue turned political. The Conservatives are saying the inquiry is descending into chaos, as also the front runner to chair the very inquiry itself has also pulled out. Let's bring in our correspondent Molly Malone, who's in the newsroom for us this evening. Molly, if it's not in chaos, it's certainly in trouble.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Things clearly are moving pretty quickly. There's some strength of feeling, but really it's been political this afternoon, but actually it's about how these victims are feeling, about how the process is being handled. 3 of those victims stepping down, resigning from the panel, which is supposed to be representing survivors and victims of grooming. Now, in large parts, many of their concerns have been focused really around this perception, this idea that much of the direction of the inquiry is being sort of diluted, perhaps broadened out to look in the round at child sexual abuse, when actually many of these victims want a proper focus, quite a narrow focus on looking at grooming gangs. And that's because they want potentially any racial or religious motivations behind their abuse, which they've experienced for so many years, to be properly addressed and for that to be properly looked at. Now, there was an urgent question in the Commons today. That's, as we know, a kind of topical question showing really how the concerns have erupted, the concerns of these victims. Jess Phillips, it was put to her, the Safeguarding Minister, that the process, the inquiry was descending into chaos. I think we can hear a clip of her response.
We must avoid delays, as was seen in the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, and are progressing as swiftly as thoroughness allows. Misinformation undermines this process. Allegations of intentional delay, lack of interest, or widening of the inquiry's scope and dilution are false. The inquiry will remain laser-focused on grooming gangs, as Baroness Casey recommended.
Now, it's that word that Jess Phillips used, false, that seems to have really upset one of the victims, Fiona Goddard. She's put out a response in response to hearing from Jess Phillips. I'm going to read you a little bit of it now. She said, instead of addressing these concerns, Jess Phillips has said these suggestions are categorically untrue. This is a lie. She went on to say, as a grooming gang survivor, I have been accused of lying by public institutions for years in an attempt to cover up and deny the abuse of myself and thousands of others. For the minister in charge of safeguarding to come out against me and accuse me of lying is an absolute betrayal of myself and all survivors. Now, it's worth just saying we have had then a response from the government. They've said that they're remaining focused on grooming gangs, laser focused. They say they're not broadening the scope, but instead listening to different perspectives, listening to different victims and letting the scope of the inquiry be led by what they're saying. But there are also other concerns. It's not just about this fear that is potentially being broadened out or diluted. There's concerns about the appointment of the chair of the inquiry. That's not yet happened, but it was reported that there were 2 kind of front-running leading candidates and that they were going to come from either a policing background or a social services background. That upset many victims because they said they are the very services that have let them down in the past. Clearly, the irony is what's needed for this inquiry is a chair to grip it, take hold of it and lead the inquiry. They haven't really given a time frame. They've said it's just as soon as possible. But clearly there are so many demands of victims that they want to see satisfied. And there's a long way, I think, to go before that happens.
OK, Molly in the newsroom, thank you very much indeed. Molly Malone there. Let's bring back in our panel Gwen and Andrew, who are with me. Gwen, you know some of these people who've resigned from the panel. What have they been saying to you?
I mean, I haven't spoken to Ellie today, but I was on a meeting with her Sunday last, and she was very, very adamant that it's not just the villains that need to be investigated, and it's not just the ethnicity and religiosity of those villains, but also the cover-up, the people in social work, the police forces, the political cover-up, and that's not being addressed at all at this point. One doesn't feel that's being touched at all. And this is why they're so concerned, having somebody in social work or in the police as the chair. It's been 8 months since this was promised, and they don't even have a chairman of this report. And one last thing. Ellie is planning to stand as a candidate for reform. And as I told her, I hope to become, in Barrow, in Furness, where it happened to her, I hope she becomes head of the social cabinet. She becomes the cabinet member for social services, because she will damn well make sure that something is done.
Now, government obviously have pointed out in previous inquiries it takes time. It's often taken, I think, 9 months in the blood-affected one. But we do know that this inquiry has been talked about for a very long time, and so one might suggest that, you know, some of this stuff would be a little bit easier. Andrew, what's interesting in this, though, I think, from a political point of view, is like Jess Phillips today suggesting that she didn't necessarily agree with some of those survivors that were previously on the panel. Now one of them's calling for her to go. I mean, this is turning into the mess the government clearly would not have wanted.
Look, I think it's very difficult, and I think Gawain's right in the sense that, look, these are women who have been failed, you know, obviously suffered horrendous abuse in the first place, and then been failed by the authorities that were supposed to be there to protect them. Social services in many cases, police and the political establishment for a long time. There's no doubt that's true, and therefore having any trust in those same institutions to investigate it is very difficult. And that's been the same with the independent investigation that Theresa May, I think, set up in 2014 as Home Secretary, which took 2 years to start and find a chair that was acceptable. So, you know, this isn't surprising. And, you know, what's tragic in all these cases, whether it's this or Windrush or Hillsborough, is the people who have been the victims of this have to fight tooth and nail, sometimes for decades, just to get justice, having been traumatised in the first place, and this in the most disgusting ways as well in the first place.
When you have social work and police telling 14-year-old victims that their child prostitution shouldn't be taken seriously, when statutory rape is 16, it doesn't matter if they were child prostitutes, which they weren't.
Yeah.
Those men should have been arrested on the spot. They weren't.
And there was clearly a cultural problem right across the police forces and social services. You know,
just to turn to what happens next, though, Jess Phillips clearly does care about this issue a lot. I mean, she does.
Yet she tried to block the national inquiry.
Well, I think their argument at the time was, look, there was an independent inquiry under Theresa May, which made 20 recommendations, I think, in 2022. None of those have been implemented.
No, by the Tory party,
they
hadn't done anything.
Was,
right.
We're going to implement those, and, you know, they'd only just got into government at that point. So, you know, let's implement those first and then look at it. But actually, you know, clearly the scandal is bigger, and we now know it is bigger.
Going on.
But it's
still happening.
But the point is that what I'm trying to say is that is she not still the best advocate within government?
I don't know if she is, because she's now turning round to people on her panel and accusing them of lying, and those people have showing the evidence that they were not. How can she have the faith? How can the victims have any faith, not just in a social worker or police being in the head of the commission, but also the minister who's turning round to victims and saying they're liars when they are not?
Do you think today might be... I mean, you know, if they're now essentially saying that she needs to go, I mean, that's...
I mean, if she's lied in Parliament, then clearly she should. But I think you can interpret what she said in Parliament in different ways, because I don't think she directly accused anyone particularly of lying.
She said it was false.
She said people are saying false things, that the scope is widening, which has been repeated elsewhere, not just by some of the victims. Now, whether that's true or not, we don't know. I mean... you know, I don't know, I'm not privy to that information. But clearly, there does need to be a focused inquiry on this, is absolutely right. And, you know, we shouldn't forget that, you know, we've just been talking about child sex abuse with Jeffrey Epstein.
And it's too easy for all of us. Is
it possible that we should be looking abroad for the chairman of this inquiry from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, America, or something like that, that is outside those remit, but it still has a common law tradition, still understands the law, still understands right and wrong?
No, and certainly, I mean, all these debates when we had, and rightly, as we always end up, as in these circumstances, talking about process and about legislation and about government, it is often difficult to forget about the victims, and we should remember them. But this process is clearly very important to them and will carry on. Gentlemen, for the moment, thank you very much indeed, because we do want to turn to the other politics that's been happening today, and that's been at the COVID inquiry, because it's been hearing today about the fiasco around exam results during lockdown that left Boris Johnson apparently in a homicidal mood. The former Prime Minister rejected rejected claims that there were no plans for the mass closure of schools, but he did admit that education during the pandemic was a disaster. Sky's Rachel Venables has this report.
We must apply downward pressure, further downward pressure on that upward curve by closing the schools.
It was his nightmare scenario that became the waking reality for millions of children. And today, 5 years on, Boris Johnson is back at the COVID inquiry to give evidence on how his decisions impacted young people.
Was the loss of education a disaster? Yes. Was the loss of exams a disaster? Yes. Was the disappointment, anger, frustration of a large number of kids, the additional frustration, a disaster? Yes, it was. But it has to be seen in the context of us trying to deal with a much, much bigger disaster.
The inquiry's previously heard criticism from some in the Department for Education about the government's failure to plan early for school closures. But this is something Mr. Johnson pushed back on. I'm not inclined to accept the idea that people fell down gravely in their duty. I think people were overwhelmed by the speed of events, and when the facts changed, they had to change policy, and I had to change policy. And we heard more about the fiasco around exam grades in the summer of 2020, with an algorithm downgrading students' results. That left the then PM in a homicidal mood, so much so that he considered sacking his Education Secretary, Sir Gavin Williamson.
All I would say is that, you try coming up with a system to give a fair exam result for people when they can't sit exams. It's not easy, OK?
Boris Johnson began early on with an apology accepting responsibility for mistakes his government made, but he was keen to push back against some of his toughest criticism in questioning, speaking a lot of hindsight and trying to remind the chair and the lawyers gathered how difficult the challenge was dealing with the COVID pandemic. As he left at lunchtime, campaigners and bereaved families chanted, "Shame on you," at the former Prime Minister.
So this is a letter from a child in one of our families. She was 8 years old.
So she says here, "Mum, stay away from me." I mean, that's heartbreaking.
When I spoke to the inquiry at the very beginning of this module, I explained to them that there were options available. Of course, we're equally concerned about safeguarding children. We're concerned that those children should have access to education, but they should have had safe access to education.
This inquiry is all about learning lessons from a time when our leaders faced a series of impossible choices. Few decisions, however, will have as long-lasting an impact as those which affected and even harmed our children. Rachel Venables, Sky News in Paddington.
Well, Gwen and Andrew are still with me. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. I think we all look back and go, clearly, wrong decisions were made. But, Andrew, there was enormous pressure under the government at the time to close schools. Not just with inside government, but, across the board, it must be said.
Yeah, and there were concerns. And, of course, we didn't know exactly what we know now about the spread of it and the vulnerability of children. But also, let's not forget, a lot of those children lived with elderly relatives. There is a danger of children spreading the disease and then coming home to elderly relatives who were very vulnerable to it. And, of course, a lot of children have clinically vulnerable parents, are clinically vulnerable themselves. So, I don't think this is the biggest scandal of all of this. I think if you look at the PPE, look at social care, what happened with care homes, especially in this country, is far more damning on the government than what happened with schools.
Quite briefly?
Boris was in a difficult position. I think the first lockdown we all accepted because none of us knew. But by the second lockdown, the second time they closed the schools, my children were going through school at that time. And it was a disaster. And we knew it was going to be a disaster. And we knew by the second lockdown a lot of these things that we know now. Some of that was already through. We understood that. So, essentially, I think they panicked. And that panic, and because there was a lot of pressure, particularly from the teaching unions, from the teaching unions particularly, were desperate to close the schools.
The hospitals were filling up as well. I mean,
not with children.
Not with children, but children live in households with other people. But you can't.
The targeting of isolation could have been done so much better. We knew that by the second lockdown.
We did, but I think the schools, in my experience, and I was a parent during that as well, the schools were better prepared for the second lockdown. They were much more organised in terms of the lessons they were able to do and using modern technology to teach those lessons. So,
but that's working from home.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I mean, I remember that first week of January, and there was a lot of sense that essentially there was a real possibility that the schools wouldn't be able to operate because people were not prepared to go into work.
Yeah.
And it was massively complicated. But it is an ongoing one, and that COVID inquiry is certainly ongoing as well. We want to turn to another big issue, probably the biggest issue, certainly for the government in the next couple of months. That is the economy and this budget. My word, the chief executive of Lloyds Banking Group has been talking to Sky today, warning that another tax raid on the banks in November's budget could hurt both households and businesses. In an exclusive interview, Charlie Nunn urged the Chancellor to ignore calls for a windfall tax on commercial banks. He was speaking to our business and economics correspondent, Gurpreet Narwan, on the sidelines of the government's Regional Investment Summit in Birmingham.
There have been calls for higher taxes on the banks. They are, after all, making record profits. And the Chancellor is looking for tens of billions of pounds for her budget next month. I spoke to the boss of one of Britain's biggest banks here at the Regional Investment Summit in Birmingham. His message to the Chancellor was clear: don't even think about it. Some would say that the banks could actually be contributing more. As you know, the sector has been making stellar profits thanks to high interest rates. If we increased the bank surcharge, returned it back to its 2023 level of 8%, that could raise £2 billion. It's money that would go a long way, wouldn't it?
We do make a massive difference to the economy. We have about £900 billion invested largely in the UK. What we think we need to get a healthy economy, you definitely need a healthy financial services sector. And if we're going to have the ability and the confidence to continue to lend into the real economy, to help households and businesses invest, we need to make sure that the financial services system and Lloyds Banking Group really remains healthy in that context and committed to that growth.
So higher taxes on the banks would stop you from doing that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously tax is a matter for the government to look at, but it's definitely one of the factors that impacts our ability to support the real economy in the UK.
Higher taxes mean higher costs, and Lloyds has already set aside £2 billion to deal with potential compensation claims arising from the car finance mis-selling scandal. But the company isn't happy about the compensation scheme being consulted on by the regulator either. It thinks it's overly generous, disproportionate, and risks undermining the market. If investors leave, then costs could go up for customers too.
When you look at the implication of what's been proposed by the FCA, it's going to potentially take 20 years of profitability of the car finance industry. And what does that mean for investability in that industry and for other investors and businesses looking to invest in the UK? There's real concern that this is going to create an investability issue.
So what will happen? Will lenders exit the market?
But that would be our concern.
If the worst case scenario plays out, well, there could be spillovers for the wider economy. The Treasury is watching this one closely.
Now, of course, the reason the Chancellor is going to have to increase taxes, and she is in the budget, is because our public finances are in a pretty dire state, and we saw that quite a lot today with the latest borrowing figures. But it is also clear the government are going to start blaming Brexit quite a lot for that black hole. This is what, of course, Rachel Reeves had to say to Sam Coates last week.
Austerity, Brexit, and the ongoing impact of Liz Truss's mini-budget, all of those things have weighed heavily on the UK economy. Already, people thought that the UK economy would be 4% smaller because of Brexit. Now, of course, we are undoing some of that damage by the deal that we did with the EU earlier this year, but there is no doubting that the impact of Brexit is severe and long-lasting.
And the Chancellor again was hammering home that same line about the UK's EU withdrawal at the summit today. Rachel Reeves said, we also know that the OBR, I think, is going to be pretty frank about this, that these things like austerity, the cuts to capital spending and Brexit have had a bigger impact on our economy than was even projected back then. That's why we are unashamedly rebuilding our relations with the European Union to reduce some of those costs that were, in my view, needlessly added to businesses since 2016 and since we formally left a few years ago. Well, let's speak to one of the many Mr. Brexits, must be said around the country, Gwen Tyler. She's got a point, though, hasn't she?
No. She doesn't. The 4% is rubbish. The 4% is a projection that has no basis in reality. If you look at our trade figures, we're increasing our trade and have increased our trade across both in imports and exports. That is not the case. What he's saying is rubbish. She's accusing Brexit and she's accusing Nigel Farage, I've heard it from her and others in the Labour Party. He is a very powerful man when he can ruin the German economy, where he can ruin the French economy, he can ruin the Spanish economy. How?
The Bank of England, the OBR, the IMF, the Treasury, and lots of independent economists do say that Brexit has been a drag on our economy. I mean, you can say we're going to leave the... You cannot say, and you could say it's because we've not taken advantage of some of the things. That's fine, but you also cannot claim that leaving the world's wealthiest single market is not going to have an impact, and probably a negative one on our economy.
It has had some impacts, but it's had other beneficial impacts. Our ability to do trade deals around the world far more quickly, far more effectively than our friends on the continent. So these things can be done. This is what happens. And essentially... The Brexit was not all about the economy. It was partially about the economy. It does allow us to do those trade deals abroad. It does allow us to save our fishing grounds. It does allow us to do various other things. It allows the Labour government to put VAT on school fees. It allows a whole series of things for them to do. It gives us those freedoms. And you are right. When Theresa May went to negotiation, she negotiated with both hands tied behind her back and told our friends on the continent that that's what she was doing. So, of course, they negotiated a hard deal. They did and won.
Andrew's shaking his head here.
So Theresa May did the first deal and Boris Johnson confirmed it.
Andrew?
Look, Brexit has seriously damaged our economy. There's no doubt about that. But it's not the only thing that's damaged our economy. And the banking crash damaged our economy.
Many would say that
austerity
governments have also damaged our economy.
Absolutely. I think they've made some poor decisions economically as well. But it comes on the back of 6 or 7 things, from COVID to the spike in energy prices following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There's a whole range of things. George Osborne's austerity sapped demand out of the economy. People's finances are worse off because we've driven down wages and allowed corporations to run riot with profits.
But surely the answer to all this is not more tax. I mean, even Keir Starmer said you cannot tax your way to economic growth, can you?
I think it depends what you do with the proceeds of those taxes, and I think it depends on whose shoulders you put those taxes. Frankly, listening to the chief executive of Lloyd's Bank there, he's got a bloody cheek. They've made record profits for the past 2 years. People's mortgage rates have soared up. Right? People's interest rates on their savings haven't gone up, anything like that. They have made massive profits from higher interest rates, and they're saying, you mustn't tax us on those, otherwise we won't be able to do all these nice things, like hiking your mortgage. What a cheek! What an absolute cheek that may well be, there on a 7-figure salary, but it's also with his bank making record profits and say, no, you can't tax us, otherwise the economy might be bad. Come on.
Well, I mean, they do generate wealth, and that's a fair enough point.
For themselves.
But let's be honest about this. The biggest disgrace when it comes to the economy is that we are spending so much money servicing our debts. Absolutely. I mean, it is mad.
If you look at the fact of the matter is, the UK economy has not grown consistently or at any decent level
for over 20 years.
Yeah, since the banking crash. And that is a failure of successive governments. But actually, if you look at the governments that have done well, and you mentioned Spain just now, that's the fastest growing economy in Europe for the past 2 years. Right. And that's a socialist government that's brought in a wealth tax, brought in rent controls, capped energy prices, brought in stronger employment rights, capped transport fares. It's done a load of things that would make this Labour government go, oh my God, that's too socialist.
We know what Andrew would do. What should a reform party that apparently is now working on a new economic plan?
The first thing I would do, what we would do, I think, is address the issue of the sheer height of our energy prices. That, to us, is the fundamental. Virtually everything in life requires cheaper, more stable and sustainable energy prices. And the commitment of the last government and this government to its net zero agenda has kiboshed that. Even when the GMB admit that net zero is a disaster for jobs, for the economy, it is a disaster. How can we be paying the most expensive industrial energy costs in the world?
Thatcher privatised our energy. That's why.
There's a lot of other
we're the only
things.
ones stupid enough in Europe to have privatised our energy.
Wind farms that have to be subsidised even more when it blows.
We subsidise the oil industry. I mean, come on,
gentlemen,
this is ridiculous.
You know what? You're agreeing way too much for most of tonight's programme. I'm glad that Brexit has proved the fault line. I potentially think that you might well agree on the next story too, since we're going to become a bit patriotic, if you like, because we're going to talk about France. It's fair to say that sometimes when it rains, it pours, all the bosses come at once and all that. Well, for France lately, it's been an absolute deluge of unfortunate events, one after the other. The government, of course, has collapsed, not once, not twice. I've kind of lost count how many times they've collapsed. They're facing a debt crisis, even bigger than ours. Treasury in the Louvre have been stolen, and the country's watched its former president, Nicolas Sarkozy, walk into prison today. Sometimes here in the UK, we think it might be bad, but we look across the English Channel and think, my word, it could be worse.
France will come as no surprise to anybody, has been trailing a very substantial budget deficit for quite a few years now. There are some very hard decisions to be made.
We make a solemn appeal to the country. Do not resign yourselves. Do not lose courage. Do not divide at the grassroots. We make a solemn appeal for popular and parliamentary resistance to continue fighting against these cruel budgets.
Authorities believe this audacious heist was likely the work of an organised criminal gang.
C'est que nous avons failli. What is certain is that we have failed. This has created a regrettable image of France.
Now, don't get me wrong, I do love the French, but my word, they're having a pretty horrid time.
I mean, yeah, I think there's a lot of countries around the world.
That was probably the reaction of the French people too.
I mean, you kind of look at the UK, you look at the US, you look at France, you look at Germany. You know, a lot of the world's major Western economies are not doing well at the moment. Politically, they're pretty shambolic across the piece as well. You know, I mean, I think part of the problem for France is you've got a president sort of squatting in the Champs-Elysees who, you know, can't form a stable government. The French Parliament is, you know, I mean, the last set of elections were won by the left. They've refused
what I'm
to...
trying to get at, Andrew, here is should we be taking some solace in the fact that it could be worse?
Well, I don't know, because, I mean, you know, France still has a pension age of 62, which I think we'd look on enviously at.
That's one of the reasons they're in such a mess.
Well, we used to be called the sick man of Europe.
We did, but I noticed that didn't Starmer go to Trump and say, at least we're better than France, which is quite extraordinary.
Look, we're better than the US as well, thank goodness.
But the French, I mean, they still make great cheese, put it that way.
Yeah, they definitely still win when it comes to food and wine. There's little doubt about that.
They win on cheese, but they make great cheese.
A great national anthem. But in the end, let's be honest about this politics. The reason we're doing this is because we do compare ourselves, don't we? I mean, that is part of kind of the political makeup of the world. And particularly given the fact that they're the oldest enemies.
You do realise that? It's Trafalgar Day today.
It's Trafalgar Day today, we do.
So raising a glass to his immortal memory is the right thing to do when we watch a section like this.
But just on this, do we think that Macron's going to have to go? Just briefly, yes or no?
He's finished, whether he hangs on for a bit longer or not, he clearly can't.
But these things come around and they go around. I'm sure they were watching us during our Brexit negotiations, having a good old chuckle.
Well, they were literally laughing. We saw Macron laughing.
I think now we can have necessarily a little chuckle at them as well. Yeah. Anyway, gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure tonight. Merci beaucoup. Gwen and Andrew, thank you very much indeed. That is it for us for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow, of course, at 7. Do join me then, if you can. Up next, it's the UK Tonight with Jane Secker. Do stay tuned for that on Sky News. I'll see you tomorrow. Au revoir. Goodbye. See you tomorrow.